All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for everybody's patience and welcome to this edition of Totally Glocally. We're really excited to get started today on this edition, climate justice, decolonization, and the role of cultural relations. I'm joining you from a very damp and dreary week here in Berlin, so I've been looking forward to this bright spot today. My name is Clare Richardson. I'm a journalist and news anchor here in Berlin, and it's good to see some familiar faces there from our panel yesterday. And to all of you who are joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome. So people have been joining up. I think we can get started and kick things off. To begin, we have Dr. Odile Triebel, the head of dialogue and research on culture and foreign policy at IFA. Dr. Triebel, thank you so much for IFA's role in organizing this important event, and very much looking forward to hearing your opening remarks. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire. Yeah, welcome to the second panel discussion of the Totally Glocally Web Talks 2022, organized by IFA with the support of Ecological Institut. For those who are here for the first time, for the others, please apologize. I will explain again who is IFA. IFA is German Institute for Foreign Cultural Relations and Germany's oldest intermediary organization in the field of international cultural relations. We support artistic and civil society exchange worldwide and research on international cultural relations. Cultural relations in Germany are understood as one of the key pillars in the country's external relations. And as our Federal Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock frequently and recently again stressed that climate is the biggest security challenge of our time, we need to reflect on the role culture and cultural relations can play in a foreign climate policy with the objective of building a better, safer, more equitable and thus more peaceful future. This year, in Totally Glocally Web Talks, we will focus on communication and decolonization, and today it's decolonization. As the disastrous consequences of climate change become clearer each year, debates on what to do about it and about degrees of responsibility of countries, sectors, and individuals have become more and more heated. While the countries in the global north are responsible for the majority of historical CO2 emissions, the impacts of climate change and the capacities to deal with it are very unevenly distributed. Particularly affected by climate change are countries in the global south, many of them former colonies still struggling with the socioeconomic consequences of colonial exploitation. This twofold injustice is at the core of demands on richer countries to first come to terms with their historic emissions responsibility. Second, aid poorer and vulnerable countries in adapting to climate change. And third, to financially compensate those affected by climate-related loss and damage. The historic decision at the recent COP27 to establish a fund to cover loss and damage notwithstanding, the issues of responsibility and concrete financial commitments are certainly a step, but also most certainly there can't be a full stop. These demands overlap with processes of dealing with colonial history as well as with debates on how people and societies worldwide will have to change their life in the coming years to cope with climate change and to try to limit further degrees of warming. Simultaneously, as countries of the global south are developing, their share of global CO2 emissions is growing quickly, which means that in the medium or long term, they need to be part of the transformational solution as well. To tackle this contradictory and often emotional set of issues, interdisciplinary approaches are needed, as well as greater societal and cross-cultural engagement. Artists and cultural relations actors already play an important role in fostering cross-cultural understanding and empathy in other domains. Cultural relations between states and societies could thus be an important component of international climate policy and transnational climate action. This panel therefore discusses the following questions. What are the trends and main positions in the debates around climate justice and loss and damage? How are climate change, climate justice, and decolonization processes linked, and where are they at odds? How can actors from the cultural sector and cultural relations play a constructive role in climate policy and in debates on climate justice and decolonisation? This is what we're going to discuss today with our distinguished panelists, and not only them. I'm looking forward to an inspiring discussion with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Triebel. I'm also looking forward to the discussion we're going to have today with our panelists and with all of you. Looking forward to your questions and comments as we go through. So as Dr. Triebel has laid out, today we're going to be looking at these debates around climate justice, including the thorny issues of responsibility and financial commitments. Here is how it's going to work. We're going to begin with Dr. Pettifor, who's going to deliver a keynote presentation for us. And we will then get comment from our panelists, Dr. Bassey and Ms. Nowshin. From there, we'll move on to a panel discussion and then finally open the floor for your questions and comments. Now, just before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping rules that we can go through very briefly. Please keep your microphones off unless you're asking a question so we don't get feedback. And we would love if you are able and willing to put your camera on to see who's out there in the audience. Would love to see your face. So if that's something that you're comfortable doing, please feel free to join us and turn your cameras on. As we move into the Q&A section, you can either leave a comment or question in the meeting chat, or you can use the putting your hand up feature on Zoom if you want to contribute directly, and I'll call you to the stage to ask our panelists yourself. And if you haven't already, please do rename yourself with your real name and any institution you might represent. And a quick note that this event is being recorded and will hopefully be available on YouTube later for your reference. If you have any issues, you can speak to Anna, who's in the chat, or give her a call on that phone number you see there. So thank you very much for your patience as we went through those small items. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome our panelists. First up, we have Dr. Anne Pettifor, who is a British economist and specialist on the Green New Deal. She's also the Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, the Prime Group. Welcome, Dr. Pettifor. We also have Dr. Nnimo Bassey. He was a veteran environmental activist from Nigeria, a poet, and also the director of the ecological think tank Health of Mother Earth Foundation. And we have Ms. Tonny Nowshin, a climate and degrowth activist and campaigner for the TheSunriseProject. She joins us now from Bangladesh. So a warm welcome to all of you. I'm going to first turn the floor over to Dr. Pettifor to get us started. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Claire. And it's a great honor to be invited and to be included in this discussion. I think you're going to find that I will be looking at it from a different angle, looking at the title and the subject of this session from a different angle. I'm not choosing the word decolonisation. I think I'm choosing the word imperialism. I'm also looking at responsibility for climate breakdown in a different way too. So I hope that will provoke some discussion. And I would now like to share my screen with you. This is what I'm going to have. Right. Can everyone see that? Is that okay? Am I on the slideshow? Start here. Right. Right, so thank you ever so much again. And I'm beginning with this shot on the right, a quote from Andy Warhol, "I like money on the wall," and this picture of the dollar bill as kind of symptomatic of my theme, if you like. So the first thing I want to say is this, is that the global economy has been restructured in a very radical and dramatic way. And whereas we're used to thinking in terms of north-south, I want us to think in terms of the 1% versus the 99%, to put it crudely. We have now a global economy, which I dub the billionaire economy. This is an economy that suits the interests of the 1%, but not the 99%. And in those, and including those, I include the 99% in the north as well as in the south. So it's a global economic order, as I say, which serves the interest of wealth, those that have money, right? And we've seen how well they have done. The world's top billionaires like to feature on the front cover of Forbes. They're unashamed about the scale of their wealth, $73 billion in the case of Carlos Slim when it was last counted. But the bulk of the ultra-wealthy live in the United States. Those people with, there's about 100,000 people with at least $50 million in net worth, right? Now that's an awful lot of people that are very, very wealthy. And we saw after the pandemic how much more money the wealthy made. Now, this was partly to do with central bank activity during the pandemic, when quantitative easing was the norm across all central banks in the world. And of course, central banks have as their clients, not people like you and me, but financial institutions. And those people that work in financial institutions that have accounts with the central bank, and they're a small minority, 1% if you like, they benefited from QE. We also benefited. It enabled governments to lower interest rates and also to provide a support to the community on a very large scale. So, there were benefits for the 99%, but the 1% did extraordinarily well. And in 21, brokers for the sale of yachts told us that actually more yachts were sold then in 2020 than ever before in history. And these aren't the kind of yachts that you and I might know about. These are super yachts. These are ultra fancy yachts, which cost a lot of money. And at the same time, also, the 1% took to buying private jets. And here I'd love to show this image. This is Kylie Jenner and Travis Scott, who posted on Instagram that they were at the airport and they were battling with each other as to which jet they would take, which one they would climb onto, his or hers, because this is a couple that each have their own private jet. And that's giving a great big problem in the United States, in New York in particular, because there's just not enough hangar space for all these private jets, emitting, as you can well understand, carbon emissions. So we know that the richest 1%, which make up only 63 million people, have accounted alone for about 15% of global emissions. The richest 10% of humanity, and I am afraid I exclude myself in that category, that's 640 million people, accounted for 52% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. And that, but the rest, the 3.1 billion, which I seem to have lost, are responsible for far less. So, 3.1 billion are consuming as much as are emitting as much greenhouse gas emissions as the 21%. Now, hang on a minute, I've got a problem here. Right. So, knowing this, we can see, excuse me while I just fiddle with my screen, we can just see from this chart how what richest 1%, that one black person in the corner there, is responsible for all those emissions, the black emissions at the top, 10% for 52%, the middle 40% for that much, but the poorest 50% of the world's population are responsible for only 7% of all emissions. And I believe it's important for us to look at this crisis of emissions from that perspective and not just from a decolonisation perspective. So what we've seen, and this is the great hypocrisy of the northern economies of the countries of the north, which is that we've been having United Nations COP meetings since about 1990. The first IPCC assessment report appeared in 1990. And you can see that from that date to this, we have cut absolutely no emissions at all. There's been no reduction whatsoever in the scale of our emissions. Indeed, we've intensified the emissions, especially since the financial crisis. So what this shows is that the lie that lies behind the so-called net zero targets. Net zero means we're not going to cut emissions, we're going to postpone them into the future. Net zero means we're not going to cut our emissions. After all, we in Britain have very few emissions. We've closed down our coal mining sector, et cetera, and we've exported all our emissions, as have all Europeans, to China and to countries of the South. And we blame them for the rise in emissions. So, and then there's also profound dishonesty, if you like, fraudulent accounting around how we count emissions. We pretend to add up our own emissions, but we refuse to include airline emissions and shipping emissions. And of course, shipping emissions are what we're importing in the way of consumer goods from places like China. And the fact that we refuse to do that and pretend that we are achieving our emission goals is a part of the sort of real fraudulent attitude of the North towards this crisis. And this chart is a famous UN chart, and it again shows that there's been absolutely no progress at all in cutting emissions. We just have refused to stop. And we know that as a result of our inaction, we have only three options: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. And all greenhouse gases increase the suffering of others, both present generations and those to come. And in particular, of course, the suffering of those in the South. But I want to start with this suffering. This is, believe it or not, a section of New York City. This is the consequence of a hurricane way back in 2012. And as a result of this, and it's very seldom talked about and publicly discussed, there was massive destruction in New York. It was the largest Atlantic hurricane on record. More than 200 people died. There was $75 billion in direct damages, never mind indirect damage. There were power outages that affected 2 million people. But people in low-lying, low-income communities across northern New Jersey and Brooklyn were especially badly hit. But not everyone suffers. This is an image that I find extraordinarily symbolic of what I'm talking about. This is New York City at the height of Hurricane Sandy. Everything is blacked out. Nobody has electricity except this building in the middle. And I'd like you to guess, who do you think runs that building? Goldman Sachs, of course. So we're in a situation in which we can have a crisis like Hurricane Sandy, and the 1% can survive it, can make arrangements for their own security. The second aspect of our new globalized billionaire economy is that it slashes the incomes of the 99%. And there's a very crude number, but I mean the majority. I mean the majority of working people and also middle-income people. So under this system of deregulated debt-fueled growth and an export-led model, something that's both common to Germany and also China, that depresses wages at home, but boosts the profits of exporters. Now, the wages at home are of the majority. The profits made by exporters are profits made by big corporations, or, if you like, the 1%. This model of depressing wages at home while increasing exports is one that leads to imbalances. It leads to trade imbalances, it leads to income imbalances, and it leads to political tensions. And we see here also from the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, that the share of labor of the majority in the economy as a share of GDP, their share of the cake has gradually fallen over the period since 1980. And that means that the share of income for the majority has fallen while the billionaires have done really well. Extreme pandemic disparities meant that Oxfam was able to report that from March 18th to the end of 2020, global billionaire wealth increased by 3.9 trillion. By contrast, global workers' combined earnings fell by $3.7 trillion. And until quite recently, wages in the United States, for example, but also in parts of Europe, were negative over a year, i.e. people were earning less in a year than they had been earning the year before. And they earned a lot less than they had before the pandemic. And in 2009, the combined wealth of the world's richest 380 people was equal to the wealth of the 50% of the rest of the world. But by 2018, 26 billionaires had as much as the bottom 50%. So 26 billion people were earning, at least in 2009, there were a few more of those rich people. But in 2018, only 26 billionaires equaled the amount. So this is my point about this massive imbalances in the global economy. Here you can see the wealth share compared to the population, the red chart. Those with more than $1 million, the wealth share is quite small. With those with more than 100,000, it's a bigger share. Those with 10,000, it's a bigger share. And those under 10,000, they have very small share of the wealth. But here's the thing, this is the macroeconomic point that I want to make. The wealthy spend only a small percentage of their income, not enough to keep the economy churning. Lower income people, on the other hand, spend almost everything they have, which is shrinking, which is becoming less. Most workers aren't earning nearly enough to buy what the economy is capable of producing. This has macroeconomic consequences, but it also has ecological consequences because we are now leading to overproduction and underconsumption. I have family in Vietnam, and they've come over to London for Christmas. And I took my daughter-in-law shopping at the Marks and Spencer's, and she wanted to buy woolies to keep herself warm, woolen vests and so on. And in M&S, you could not buy a single vest. You had to buy two, right? So they were only selling them in packages of two. This is a sense of our overproduction. Of M&S has got too much of this stuff and is trying to dispose of it. That's just a small example of excessive production and underconsumption. Most workers really don't have enough money to buy what they earn. So this too in turn leads to debt inflation. What we see is rather than too much purchasing power chasing too few goods and services, too many goods and services are chasing too little purchasing power. So consumers take on debt to try to keep up a basic standard of living, and firms do the same because they're under pressure as their sales fall short of purchases. And we see that a country like China that saves, the workers in China are many on low incomes, they have poor social security, they are saving their income. And what China does is to export its surplus to absorb excess production, essentially. And the same applies to Germany. So here we have the rise in debt, and the IMF and the World Bank are reminding us constantly what a very grave threat this represents to the global economy. I wrote a book in 2006 predicting the great financial crisis, and that was on the basis that debt to GDP, in other words, debt to the world's income was about 250% of GDP. Today, it's almost double that, right? And we know that's a form of imbalance that can cause a financial crisis. And this is affecting low-income countries in the South. What's the result of it since 2000? This is how they've built up their debts. Now, the green charts, the green is private non-guaranteed debt. The red colors at the below, that's publicly guaranteed debt. And the black is short-term debt. And we see since 2000 how dramatically that's risen. And then combine that rise in debt with the mighty dollar, and we know that this last year, the dollar's been on a tear. It's gone to zoom up, mainly because interest rates in the United States have been higher than the rest of the world. That's caused massive imbalances for the rest of the world. Here we see a chart of the the currencies versus the dollar, and almost all of them are below where they were before. The worst, of course, is Sri Lanka, but there's Turkey, there's Argentina, there's Poland, and so on. You know, countries of Latin America, Africa, and the Southeast Asia. So this is a result also of the global economy. And as the international financial system, this billionaire economy, is self-regulating, there's very little regulation of market-based finance. There's no sound framework, this is something very close to my heart, for resolving sovereign debt crises in poor countries. In pure market theory, the citizens of poor countries remain infinitely liable to pay international debts incurred by their governments, even if their exchange rate has collapsed for reasons that have to do with the United States rate of interest in the dollar, independent of their own actions. The debt, therefore, has a hugely higher value than when it was incurred. And this is deeply unfair, and I feel passionately about this, and we can talk about that at great length. And this is a form of imperialism, in my view. This is a form of gunboat diplomacy, but slightly in a different guise. And I've worked, for example, on the debt of Argentina, and what we argue in our report on this, which is on our Prime website, is that thanks to the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the United States, the financial boycott imposed on Argentina by US courts was unprecedented in its exercise of extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's a modern version of gunboat diplomacy. In this way, a weapon that should be used against international criminals and terrorists was used simply to enforce payment of the debts owed by private US creditors who speculated in the past on Argentine debt at rock bottom prices. So the system is deeply unfair to countries of the South. Then this brings me on to the question of culture, because the globalized system, the billionaire economy, designed on terms that suit the 1% and shaped by offshore capital flows and markets, and animated not by productive, sustainable investment in making and creating things, but rather by speculative rent seeking. Now, rent seeking is when you own an asset, say a work of art or a racehorse or a property, and you can draw rent from that effortlessly. Once you own the asset, you can sit back on your butt and collect the rent, right? And so what we're finding is that in the current global economic system, investors prefer rent seeking to actually the risk of investing in land and labor, if you like. Now, in that sense, the private sector is saying we don't want to take risks. We really don't want to make an effort to create and to build and to manufacture. Instead, we simply want to collect rent. So we see that we are transforming a nation of creative producers into a community of rentiers, increasingly living on others, seeking gratification and more useless consumption with all the debilitating features of the bread and circuses of imperial Rome. That's what a famous economist, Nicholas Caldor, wrote in 1971. And here is an example of it. I own a piece of work, a work of art by Andy Warhol, and I know that it will increase in value over time. I do not have to do anything. I can hang it on the wall. And when I sell it again, I'll make effortlessly a massive capital gain on it. And many of the very wealthy don't even hang their money on the wall. They store them in vaults, so they're invisible. They're hidden away, but they're still there as an asset. They can say, I have a Picasso in the vault. Please lend me another $100 million against the value of this Picasso. And the bank says, sure, yeah, you've got a work of art in that art storage capacity in Miami. You can have $100,000. That's the value of just owning assets for the purposes of collecting rent. But this feature of the global economy applies across the board. So these are owners, Silicon Valley platforms that own intangible assets. If you think of Uber, Uber has borrowed software from others like GPS and Gmail and Google Search and so on, bundle it together in a piece of software, and they now sell that asset to millions of people around the world. And these people can be ordinary working class people who have, like, they become the capitalists. They have to they have to have the capital to buy the car. They have to keep the car going. And more importantly, and most expensively, they have to pay insurance on the car. So here we see the worker becoming the capitalist, but the platform in Silicon Valley collects rent on every single ride that the worker who owns that car makes. And similarly, of course, with Airbnb and other platforms. This is an example of the rentier economy. And what's so striking about it is that if you sell tomatoes in the global economy, or widgets, or computers, or not computers, but if you sell almost anything that has intellectual property, you have the protection of the state. If you sell tomatoes or bananas, you don't, because they're not copyrighted. You don't have intellectual property on that product. But if you sell some software, you do, and the state protects that. So under this new order, there is increased concentration of economic power, and the owners of intangible assets face even less competition than they did before, thanks to the state-financed protection of intellectual property. If you look at Bill Gates and Microsoft, Bill Gates pursues relentlessly anyone who would dare to use his software on their computers without paying him rent every month. I get very annoyed at Microsoft. They're constantly checking on whether I'm paying my royalties on their asset. But it gets worse, because in the South, big corporations acquire plants and patent them, give them intellectual property rights, which is then supported by the state. And as my friend Vandana Shiva argues, this is biopiracy. This is piracy with a different name. So then there's speculation on food. Have I still got time, Claire, or have I talked too long? No? Okay.
We are coming toward the end. So if you could wrap it up in the next couple of minutes, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just show you that this happens also to oil and to wheat, because what we've done is to financialize these things. This shows you a chart. The blue line is the amount of money that was aimed at grain markets when the crisis began in Ukraine. And with it, the price goes up. When you throw a wall of money at a finite asset, you increase the price. And that's what is causing people in the South and the North to suffer from hunger this winter. Equally, the price in oil has empowered presidents like Putin. President Yeltsin and Gorbachev did not have the power of that. Now, this price in oil is not determined by Putin, it's determined by global markets. So the problem with all of this focus on assets and how important they are is that when this asset price bubble bursts, that causes financial crises, as it did in Japan in 1989, in 2000, and in 2006 and 2007, and again in March 2020, when the shadow banking sector crashed. So we're seeing already how these assets are falling in value, and the central banks care not about asset price inflation, because it's tough to make the rich lower the price of their assets. They care a lot about consumer price inflation. But the difference between CPI and API is that when asset prices collapse, they cause global financial crises. And this is what we're beginning to see as assets like Clare and crypto and luxury watches all begin to fall in value. So my conclusion is that we are now in a position where, once again, the global economy is probably going to fail, and the cost for that will be borne, if you like, by the 99%, not just the South and not just the North. And I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pettifor, for that fascinating talk and very bleak outlook. It's a billionaire's world and we're all just living in it, is my takeaway. Some really shocking and disheartening figures there. I would like to bring in Mr. Bassey for comment and additional thoughts. Mr. Nnimo Bassey is a director of the ecological think tank Health of Mother Earth Foundation. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It really took us to the background that help us understand where the climate crisis is coming from. It's often very convenient to just look at the carbon molecules in the atmosphere and begin to count how much we have there. What is the carbon budget, without looking at where the problem started from. This is extremely important to understand the root causes, because if we don't understand the root cause of the problem, it's difficult to prescribe to find a way out of the problem. And everything we're seeing with regard to climate change, especially in official circles of negotiations, constitutes simply digging deeper into the problem, not getting out of the pit. And everything that has been presented, and I like the analysis, the presentation of not just talk about colonialism, but talking about imperialism, because again, as we know, colonialism itself is alive, at least in many sectors. And then imperialism has never diminished at all. It's getting stronger, more blatant, and we're seeing massive footprints across the earth of what we may call irresponsible behavior by the powerful and by the rich, people who are more or less above the law. So we're having a lawless global system that is very unequal and doesn't really care what happens to those who have been trampled upon. This has made it very difficult to find solutions to the global warming problem. First of all, a very deliberate attempt to ignore the root causes. At the just held COP27, in extra time beyond the days that were scheduled for the COP, delegates were grappling with the fact that whether they should include in the outcome document the fact that global warming is caused by fossil fuels and that these should be phased out. In Glasgow, they talked about phasing down unabated coal. They find words that look so that people can jump onto and say, oh, this is fine. Unabated coal is different from coal. And so you can keep burning as fast as you can show that it's abated. This has made it possible for polluters to run the show rather than listening to the people. And so as I was just mentioning about the COP again, at the end of the day, nothing. Even climate justice in the outcome document of Glasgow, as well as El Shamshek, climate justice in the document is in quotes as though it's not clear what it means. And it's just incredible that these world leaders do not know what climate justice means. They have to put it in quotes, kind of a total disdain for the victims of global warming, who can be found actually all over the world, not just in the global south. We've seen the fires in the United States, in Australia. We've seen the floods, the storms. And I'm happy you showed a picture of a part of New York City that was flattened. And yet they wouldn't lay a finger. And that's because, again, the polluting industry is in the driving seat, helping to draft the articles of the agreement. Imagine the debate on Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement still lingers on. They just ended COP. Before the beginning, there was a document trying to define what it means to carbon removal, what it means. And they define this as kind of taking carbon out and storing them in long-lasting reservoirs on land, in the sea, and maybe in the air. Now, long-lasting reservoirs, that is a very interesting language. And it comes again, aligns with the idea of net zero, for example, as was stated by Pettifor. Now, net zero is a non-solution. It's a no-brainer. It's just saying we're going to go with business as usual, and then in a future time, this will be achieved. A kind of offloading the burden of climate action to future generations. This is something that we shouldn't allow to happen at all. Something that should be allowed. Carrying on with making profit and then letting those who come after us grapple with the problem. If you could store carbon, in a long-lasting vessel or reservoir, that very fact that it's long-lasting connotes the fact that there's a terminal there. It could be 1 million years from now, and it fails. So what happens to those who, if there's anybody around on planet Earth in 1 million years, what happens to them? How do they cope with this thing, this crisis that is taught by politicians and by industry for that future generation? Really, really very shocking. We've seen so much invested in non-solution, but it's never non-solution in the sense that it's just a useless idea, because there's always a profit motive behind those non-solutions. Selling carbon in trees. So you see a forest, you never see a forest as a living ecosystem. You see a forest as a carbon stock. All the trees are just carbon standing. And we forget that our bodies have carbon too. Why don't we count ourselves for carbon offsetting and for carbon trading? So if I have a big population, I would say, well, we are moving carbon, moving around the streets. Allow us to have some carbon credits. That never happened, but trees don't speak. And this is why we must speak for the trees. Trees don't speak, and so they could be utilized and abused in any way. Again, so sometimes we really have to understand that the global economic system is rigged against the majority and rigged in favor of the 1%, the rich or 1%. And the way things are being run really needs, how would I put it now? It needs global solidarity. The 99% can't afford to allow 1% to keep trashing everything. We need to come together. And I saw a bit of that happening, especially just before COVID. The global movement built by young people, very young people, was building momentum, millions on the street, and suddenly the COVID provided a very convenient reason to lock people up and scatter the movement. And that has been difficult to recover. It's something I think we need to work on. Now, the export-led growth model is another problem. And in fact, I love also the way you presented the issue of what I would call fiction of money. Yeah, because money essentially is fiction. When I was growing up, I saw we were using a British pound, I think, in my country. And then we had the Nigerian pound, and they used to write on the money, the Central Bank of Nigeria promises to pay. In other words, you have something in your hand, it's just a promise. It's never really tangible. It's nothing it's a promise that this has value. And so people can afford to hang their money on a frame on the wall and just make billions out of it. This is one big challenge we have in Africa also right now. In Nigeria, there are a lot of rich, very rich people, but very little productivity, very little production. Because you can make money from money to money, nothing in between. So the labor is gone, everything is gone. The fossil fuel sector that is contributing to the crisis in the world, and particularly in Africa, employs only about 1% of the workforce on the continent. 1%. And yet this is the sector that is trashing the environment, trashing the economy, and bringing about what we may call voodoo economics, with politicians happy to just receive foreign exchange from foreign banks without any productivity on the ground. No employment, no investment. In fact, only 5% of the investment in the fossil fuel sector is carried out in Africa. In fact, of the investment in Africa, just 5%. So financialization and rent seeking is such a grievous problem that needs to be tackled. The continent is always presented, pardon me for using Africa as an example, because I'm sitting in Africa and the problem is all around me. Now, Africa is presented as a poor continent, but it's a net exporter of finance. Every year, the money that goes out of the country is much more than the aid that is sent by benevolent rich countries. Yeah. And so if you find a situation where all this extraction, resource extraction, financial extraction, and all the labor extraction going on through brain drain, I guess we really need to sit down, reorder the economics, if we have any hope of tackling the global warming crisis. Now, yes, after listening to that presentation, one question that could come to mind is there any hope at all? Do we just give up? Or are we going to plot a coup that what we heard happen in Germany yesterday? Was it? Yeah, I was so shocked to see that news that some people plotted a coup. I thought I was reading about Burkina Faso or somewhere. But you know, that people can be so blatant is really something shocking that shows that we should build global solidarity. Global, this is very essential to understand each other, to share narratives, to build cultural understanding. And I believe a lot of the solution to the problems we're facing, they are not up there in the air, they're right on the ground, in the grassroots. And this wisdom needs to be respected. They need to be understood and utilized. But there's a lot of wisdom. My organization runs a program we call Learning from the Wise. And we just spend some time sitting down with knowledge holders and hearing from them. Whether they're young or they're old, as long as they have knowledge that we know needs to be shared, we sit down, keep short, and listen to them. We need to have more of this around the world. We need to have stronger social movements. We need to encourage more investment in low emission assets. Right now, Europe is pouncing on Africa for gas and oil because of the war in Ukraine. And what is happening? Big infrastructure being invested in to build a pipeline from Nigeria to Morocco along the West African coastline to take gas to Europe. All that investment, the billions that we spent on infrastructure that is designed in Europe and installed in Africa to extract resources from Africa to Europe to burn into the atmosphere and create crisis for everybody. So this, the economic model that promotes extraction of any sort in a very unbalanced manner is both unjust and should be terminated. And finally, my comment on this, I must say I'm completely blown away by that presentation. It's something I would like to see replicated around, and that quote from Vandana Shiva was so on spot. The theft going on around also enormous, that we need to recognize the fact that there's no time for us to pretend that we don't know what is going on. My final thought is on what happened at Sharm el-Sheikh in terms of loss and damage. This is being celebrated, of course, justifiably, because the campaign for that to even be acknowledged took a long time, almost 3 decades. But what do we have in the Paris Agreement? Nationally determined contributions, which the Prime Minister of Barbados mentioned in Glasgow, that national actions alone will not solve the problem. We need global solutions that are aggregated together so that we see what the outcome would be. Now, according to the UNEP emissions gap report issued before COP27, we've seen that if all the countries do what they said they were going to do, rich and poor countries, those who have caused the problem and those who are suffering the impact, if they do all they said they were going to do, the world is heading to 2.7, 2.8 degrees Celsius temperature increase above pre-industrial level, showing that the NDCs are not going to work because they're all voluntary. We have to go beyond the voluntary emission reduction and do what needs to be done. I've also heard from delegates from rich countries saying that they would never accept liability or accept the idea of climate reparation. But we can't forget the history of where the carbon came from. Neither can we forget where the global economy is rigged and operated. That if we decide to ignore the lopsided economic system, the kind of geopolitics going on in the world today, ignore the historical basis of the problem that we're having, then what would that amount to? It means that loss and damage would be charity. And charity would not solve a problem created by capitalism, created by imperialism, created by colonialism, created by slavery. I don't think it's going to work. It will not. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I'm grateful I had this opportunity to both listen and to respond to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Mr. Nnimo Bassey, for those really powerful comments and bringing awareness to these profit-motivated non-solutions, as you call them, and a global economic system that's rigged against the vast majority. It was really a delight to hear your response. I'd like to turn the floor now to Tonny Nowshin for comment. She is a climate and degrowth activist and campaigner with the TheSunriseProject. So welcome, Tonny, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I must start by acknowledging that it's very intimidating to be witness that very strong presentation by Dr. Pettifor, and also hear what Dr. Bassey had to share and comment on the presentation. I think to start with, I think, and also I think because it was intentional and also put forward to kind of start or kick the discussion around that topic, the way Dr. Pettifor started saying that, so it's not about colonization, but then there's this element of imperialism, and that's kind of the core problem at the moment. So I would start by commenting and picking up on that that she wanted us to probably pick up on. So I think how what the presentation in detail showed us is how the financial system at the core is driving. So we see one very clear thing, that at the core of this climate crisis, there is this driving inequality, and the inequality is at the same time we see that the wealth is being piling up in one end, and on the other end we see more and more people who are being left behind, and that kind of also shows in a way how we have created this economic system that does not consider people at all. And I want to start by also shedding light or questioning that, how that should be very absurd, or that should be for us, we talk about it and we take much time to in detail understand the process and how it's killing us. But at the same time, I think I want to start by acknowledging and kind of bringing that in, that if you think about what's the purpose of a human society, or like all this time we have existed on this planet, there's always this one narrative that capitalism wants us to believe that we are this very competitive being, and we are always fighting against each other. That was always the reason and how we developed. But at the same time, I want to flip that around. And again, like if you look at the indigenous communities and see there isn't as much inequality in those societies. Of course, there is not in terms of consumption. There's not this high consumption status. There's not this high production. But at the same time, we don't see this absurd inequality. And at the same time, this very normalization of leaving behind majority of the society. There is this always care and connected and existing together. That's somehow at the very core of those societies. And I think that I want to kind of uplift from all of this, that how our society has become so normal, and kind of probably again like that is also one core problem, that how all of this production, all of this consumption and this wealth accumulation is at the cost of majority of the people. And it also does not consider, of course, then if it's not considering its own population, the human being, it is very used to being this extractive structure that takes all other species as dispensable, and at the same time, the whole planet. So I think that kind of always nice or important to take into perspective when we're opening a conversation about kind of climate change and how we want to tackle and also want to connect, because it's also today we are talking a bit how the culture can help, and how that's kind of one element to this discussion, how we can use it as a solution. So I think that's one very important bit. And then following on that, this is also again what we see, that this world, there's often we talk about this global north and global south, because there is a very deep colonial history that has allowed this stage of capitalism where this rent-seeking attitude is now driving, or kind of in the driving seat of the crisis. But at the same time, still in many different layers, the older processes are also existing. That I think that was also quite clear from what Dr. Bassey was saying. And also in terms of there's still this old school extractive capitalism that's existing. There is also in different parts of the world, there's just old school capitalism that's existing within global south. So we see then the borderline, if you want to draw a line of who would be who's the victim and perpetrator, it's not very clear as it would have been maybe 300 years ago in terms of certain. Now it's much more difficult in putting it in national boundaries or certain parts of the world. There is within global south, there are perpetrators. And within Global North, there are also people who are being impacted, who are being the first on the front line. But there's still, I think it's also important and useful to remember how still there's a geographical impact that creates certain privileges. And also there's, again, because of this generational wealth and because of, again, referring back to Dr. Pettifor's presentation, who would have the chance to protect themselves when the crisis hits, also the one person who already also has the resources and the means to protect themselves. And if you think, like, again, like looking back, so there is also the distribution of billionaires. There's certain, of course, clear division between Global North and Global South, who a majority part of those billionaires are in Global North. And a lot of this structure in the global world order, it's still these countries, these old early industrialized nations who are still in the driving seat, who gets to shape, who has this special tool to be able to shape the whole international trade relations and the rules that shapes them. So World Bank, WTO, all of those, even international courts, which the corporates even get to sue a government for stopping their profits. So these are all, we see, again, very highly skewed in favor of certain parts of the world, and specifically early industrialized countries. So I think that's why it's still very, very relevant to then look with a decolonial lens and to be able to then integrate, hold these both nuances when we understand how the economies are working and how the processes are playing out. And at the same time, we still see the legacy of this historical legacy that's also still very much present today. And on the third point as well, then going towards more how we build solidarity. So then, as we understand, then there's this nuances. And I think what's very powerful is that this presentation gives us this very clear understanding then, of course, who the enemy is. If we ever talk like the system change, but then at the same time, the system there are specific areas, institution that wears the mask of the system very clearly, who are most defending the system, then that gives us this chance to be able to identify so who we have to fight against. So that's very helpful, useful, but at the same time also then when we build solidarity, when we're talking about building cross nation, because that also means we as I was saying at the beginning, that this distribution of power is not just limited to the nation boundaries. So, and we need, as rightly Dr. Bassey said, that we need to build to fight this. We have to build this global solidarity. But within that, I think it's also important from experience of anyone who has been involved with the climate movement, climate justice movement, and have been doing the work, also knows how even within, while we try to build that solidarity, we see how this narrative of colonial power even plays out when we are trying to build a solidarity, how within the people who's fighting the structure and the system in Global North and the people who's fighting the structure and the system Global South, how sometimes this automatically, this colonial legacy brings into another power because it exists. So unless we learn to name it and understand it, we wouldn't be able to work through it and build effective solidarity. So that's where also why the discussion of decolonialism is very, very relevant, powerful, and important, useful at this point, to then be able to understand and do that work to work through those elements. And then comes to this cultural bit of when we say, so then how do we navigate those discussions, those work? And a lot of the thing, what's important for us, I think, how colonization, of course, have shaped our collective imaginary, has shaped a lot of the narrative, and in a way, who holds power. So then it's also kind of like a work of epistemology, like how, again, so then I'm going back, sometimes I think one thing that stood out to me was in the, like, Dr. Vandana Shiva is amazing, and her work, we revere her. But what I'm trying to say with this example that I'm going to say now is to say that how a mainstream narrative even influences us that we start speaking in that language. So we say, of course, the property, and it's also important because we have to, when we're fighting a mainstream, a established hegemony, like a narrative, we have to use, sometimes we end up using that narrative. So when she says that the corporates are now taking up this indigenous plans and this property rights, kind of, it's also one way that shows, I think, this is what the corporates are. Of course, that's what they want to do. They keep trying to find ways to put their claim, because this is the right of kind of making sure you can make profit off of everything, of nature, and that's the way of you can put a number, put a right on it. But at the same time, I think the idea, like originally, of course, the indigenous people themselves, they do not subscribe to this concept of property rights, right? And there is no, and this in their epistemology, it's not this whole concept of property rights and how intellectual property rights should exist. So that would mean that we learn to completely deconstruct this power that the property rights, intellectual property rights now it's creating, and creating this hierarchy. And that would mean being able to go out. So probably the solution is not property rights versus property rights, or how do we protect, but it's kind of how we deconstruct it completely and decolonize that narratives as well. And I'm sure probably that's what also, of course, was there, but I just wanted to pick that bit out, that how there is also like we are forced to use the same language even when there is a existing narrative that's very powerful. So within all of these points, I think this is where I would like to close by kind of saying that it's not going to be easy in a way to build a, because we see how the crisis is so because it was, again, from all the presentation and all the input, it was very clear why we also don't see solutions, because there is invested money, invested power, and the whole structure that created the crisis is also still at the driving seat. And it's very, so if we ask the same system, we won't get solution from the same system and structure that created the problem. It's impossible for that structure to provide a solution. And that means we have to build alternatives. We have to learn to be coming out of the structure and looking at it and saying how the whole thing is absurd on its foundation, and what would that mean to build those organizing structures. Then for us, what would a economics look like? And at the core, the problem is that redistribution. So how do we bring those things into the discussion? Why do we, so at the same time we have this huge amount of money, and then at the same time debt, like this is so absurd. So what would be a very alternative suggestions that would allow us to break through this existing economic power relations and also allow us to build those alternative systems? I think that is kind of very interesting work. And at the same time, how we create this supporting culture and narratives, like tools that we need, that we don't have to keep using the same tools and the same languages of the existing structure that created the problem. That is probably another work that we would need in terms of building the global solidarity and working towards a solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those comments. And your final concluding remarks are in fact exactly the point that I want to bring up with Drs. Pettifor and Bassey. Just before I do, I just want to ask everybody in the audience, if you do have questions or comments, now would be a great time to put them in the chat. Or if you would like to ask a question directly yourself, you can put your hand up and we will come to you before the end of the session if possible. But to pick up on what Tonny Nowshin has so beautifully laid out in her response just there. Dr. Pettifor, when you look at these structural issues and exploitative relationships, what do you think needs to be done in concrete terms? Can we put into more explicit words what building these alternatives that she refers to actually looks like?
Sure. And first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Bassey and Tonny Nowshin for those remarks. And yes, everything they've both said, they are right about raising. And I apologize, I should have added another half hour to my presentation and included some of what I think are the solutions. But I just want to come back to Tonny's point about the need to use the decolonisation framing. I don't for a moment disagree that the power relations between North and South are more or less unchanged, and that applies within movements as well. And I have a lot of experience of that with the Jubilee 2000 movement to cancel debts, where, you know, campaigners in the North were always better resourced than campaigners in the South. But I will say this, that the reason we were able to get about $100 billion of debt cancelled for 30 countries, it's small beer, but at the time it was a lot of money for those countries, was precisely because we had a North-South alliance. And keeping that North-South alliance going in the context of colonization and power was hard, you know, but nevertheless it was powerful. When the IMF went around the world, to Mexico, to Vietnam, or to Africa, or to London, or to Germany, they came across the same messaging, they came across the same resistance, they came across the same fight for justice for the poor countries. And they were astonished. They didn't believe we could do that. They didn't think we could be a global organization because we were such a small little charity. But the fact is that I still think there's great power in those alliances. But of course, there is a power difference as well. I think what I regret is that, of course, I didn't address the solutions. But I think for me, and I learned that from Jubilee 2000, the really important thing is, first of all, to understand the balance of forces in the world. And if we still interpret them in terms of North-South, we are missing something. I mean, just something. And the reason I think that's important is that in environmental terms, the way in which reducing emissions is discussed is always in terms of, you are all responsible, we are all responsible for this, we must all cut our emissions. In reality, if the 1% cut their, this is what Professor Kevin Anderson argues, that if we persuaded the 1% to reduce their emissions to the level of the average European citizen, we would cut a third of emissions in a year, right? So my point is this: in terms of advocacy and getting change, it's very hard to ask billions of people to do something. It's not hard to ask, 10 million or 1 million or 7 million people to do so and make them do something. The fact is, those people do not each have to have their own private jets, that couple, right? That should not be allowed. We should be forcing them to cut those emissions. We should be making it illegal to have a private jet or to have a fancy yacht. And that was going to lead us into, so because it makes us feel helpless that everybody has to change everything in order. And I think part of that framing is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy by those who want business as usual, because it's very hard to do. So part of my thesis is that by understanding these forces, we can select what we do and where we aim our efforts. If we aim our efforts at 100% of people, it's going to be really hard and diffuse. If we aim it at 1% and we all get together and say, it's shocking that you've all got private jets, it seems to me we began to begin the process of cutting emissions. Anyway, that takes another whole session to explain, to start addressing how we, within this framework, how we would then begin to find the solutions. But can I thank my fellow commentators for their remarks, which were powerful.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bassey, what do you think? Does that go far enough for you? Or do we, as you hinted at earlier, just give up in this impossible fight based on structural issues? What would you suggest?
Well, we can't afford to give up. And again, the solutions are many. There are things we can all do. Individually, there are things we have to do collectively. And I want to add that what we need to do collectively is to be something that we have to cooperate upon. The major cause of the crisis is promoted by the fossil fuel industry. Why don't you starve them of funds? Why don't we target the financial institutions who are putting the money on the table for them to continue to destroy everything? I've seen that work to some extent with regard to the East African crude oil pipeline, where a combination of forces from Europe and Africa have campaigned very strongly against financial institutions and banks, and many pulled out of that enterprise. Unfortunately, Chinese and Total are still pushing ahead. And then also, I believe that citizens of France in particular should demand that corporations with their home headquarters in that country should stop extracting fossil fuels anywhere in the world. I mean, there's a rule that they can't extract at home. So why extract abroad? Let's have a common platform that if a country agrees that this is not good, what is good for the goose, as they say, is good for I know that kind of saying. So yeah, I really think that the simple wisdom of keeping fossils in the ground is something that we need to push. All of us will push. It will be difficult. There's a justice component to that. Those who have to stop immediately, those who may just continue for another 2 years or 3 years, but it's something that we have to do collectively. Demand that this civilization has to wind down so that we can build a new one that is more respectful of nature and all the beings on earth.
Thank you. And Tony, just to come back to you now that we're starting to identify who to fight against on this panel, do you want to tell us a little bit more about specifically what building these alternatives should look like? What would your recommendation be?
So definitely picking up on just the last example of the East African crude oil pipeline, ECOP, and financing. So we need a different financial system and kind of, I mean, it's also, of course, because closely professionally, that's something that I work in, and that would mean the way still today we see how investors put money in is driven by, so not any kind of other consideration than just the money, the returns. So this fundamentally has to shift because there is still no indicator, no way to include in the decision-making of investment, the end impact of those projects. And so while at the same time, it's crazy that there's still so much money going into the fossil fuel, the whole industry, not just projects. But at the same time, it's still very, in short term, it promises good return. And we see these examples of how the financial advisor tells their client that even at 2 degrees, apparently even at 2.5 degrees of warming, the investors' wealth of decreasing, there's only about maybe a 9% chance that their wealth would decrease, which is completely a lie. Anybody who knows how things are going to go, but we still see there's this huge discrepancy between the real world impacts. So this is one example. So, but that means these alternatives would mean we have to look, and this is where I think the solution is, there's no one solution. The solution will be pluralistic, and that means also there is no one way doing this. So we would look into sector by sector. So starting with finances, where with the one that's driving this the most, we have to start with the finances and changing it. The economic decisions, how we prioritize, that has to be completely different, like the way we prioritize where money goes. And then we go to even local levels, how we organize people, how we even live. So this is where, and I disagree maybe a bit with Dr. Anne, that this wouldn't be, we cannot just by targeting this 1% and making them give up their flights, we wouldn't be able to come out of this solution. We would have to fundamentally start living differently. We would have to reorganize the way we make decisions in our economies, how we coexist. And still there is this, even an average European is in the top, if not 10%, in the top 15%, top 20% of this wealth distribution of the world population. And there is also this history, the wealth and the privilege that sits on has this colonial history. So there is a deep responsibility to untangle that work, to give back, to build up those works. So that would mean to creating alternative structure, global, and I probably exactly what she shared, her organization was doing this global solidarity work, which you believe we would need more and more those kind of global work and structures and civil society initiatives. check.
Thank you so much. I want to take a couple of questions. I know we're coming toward the end of our time, but since we got off to a late start and this is such an important and fruitful discussion, if it's okay with everybody, I would ask Bengi Guven, who has his or her hand up. Hi, welcome. Please go ahead and ask your question and let us know who it's for.
Hi, thank you very much. My question is for all the panelists actually, but first of all, I would like to say thank you. It was extremely interesting and really insightful, all the presentations. So I am a lawyer and a researcher who's focusing on earth jurisprudence. And as we talked about colonialism throughout the presentation, law is an extremely biased field as well. And the current legal systems are shaped in a way that protects the status quo. And for example, the intellectual property example from Vandana Shiva and the seed sovereignty is a fantastic example of that. And I believe in order to move forward, the law needs to reflect what's needed in society right now. But how do you see this change, or what kind of, what would your recommendation would be in order to create a legal system that is covering all of the necessities that our society has right now?
And who is this question directed to?
To all the panelists.
Okay, let's start with Dr. Pettifor and go from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bengi. I mean, that's a really important point and something that I've come up against as well in my work. I mean, for me, the issue is whose law, basically, fundamentally with the global economy as it is at the moment and the relationship, if you like, between the North and the South. The law is what is made in the North, and in particular, what is made in the United States. And so this is why I insist on an imperialist lens for looking at this. You know, I think it should be possible for countries to have their own legal systems and for them to be able to live within their own legal systems. But if your economy is oriented towards exporting, then you have to obey what are called global laws through the World Trade Organization and so on. And you are subject to the laws of the most powerful. So partly, I mean, for me, the answer is greater policy autonomy for governments and for countries. And greater policy autonomy brings me to one of the other really important solutions to this crisis, and that's an end to capital mobility. Capital mobility, for me, is the thing which allows the globalized sector to exist, if you like, beyond the boundaries of countries and beyond the legal boundaries of countries. Now, countries need to have, for policy purposes, they need to have boundaries. Money hates boundaries, right? Money wants to go without friction from here to avoid taxes to there, where they don't have to pay taxes, from Africa to Europe, and so on and so forth. And as long as that's the case, then I don't think it's possible to talk about managing the law, because the law then is what suits Amazon or what suits Google, and they are protected by US IP law and other kinds of law. But they're also protected by this global law, which is that money should not have any friction anywhere. Never must it be restrained. So when the dollar strengthens, and then if money wants to rush out of poor countries and go straight to the United States, that should be allowed, because that's the free market, the free movement of capital. For me, it's about restoring autonomy, and that means capital controls. And with autonomy, then there comes greater power over your legal system. So, you know, that's the order in which I would see it, Bengi.
And Dr. Bassey, would you like to respond as well to that question?
Well, let me just chip in that because the 1% extracts profit from extractive activities in nature, we could all promote the acceptance of ecocide crime in the Rome Statute, although not all countries are signatory to the International Criminal Court. But it would be a big incentive for those who are devouring our ecosystem to behave differently. And this could have positive impact in terms of managing the carbon that's being released through destructive fossil fuel and other extractive activities.
Thank you very much. And Tonny, I'll bring this to you as well, just to round it off. And I would also like to add to it a question that we had in the chat from Daniela about the role of civil society and whether people just have to rely on the decisions of governments and multilateral institutions and laws and policies here. Thank you.
Thanks. I will quickly share maybe 2 examples in terms of, because the question was how can we build alternatives? And I think, so because I was like that. I thought law historically was this amazing thing that was always protecting people and rights, where the other structure, the executive, was not so pro people, or even, and the rich people was not. And then I learned, and again, that's not always the case. There have been laws have been made to allow extracting and exploiting people. Even a lot of cruelty was given legitimacy by structures and the legislative system. So I think that is already then one thing, being aware, and then looking at the moment, what are those structures, those laws that exist today in international terms and in local terms as well, that is allowing for exploitation, like taking away power from countries to defend themselves. Like, for example, I know this case where Colombia didn't want to allow an international oil company or gas, this I forgot, in a part of Colombia. They didn't want them to be to allow the digging. And then that company that brought Colombia to put a, how you call it, this international court where the corporates can sue a country for limiting their profits. And then because of that, and that would mean just by going to the court, Colombia would have to pay so much. So they then lift off and they gave permits. So there still exists this kind of very repressive structures. So that would be then one to trying to attack that and take that away. And on the other hand, would building powerful laws, like where in Ecuador, they allow entities, natural entities, legal rights, like a river, a forest. So I think that's like a very powerful and beautiful example. And also in Netherlands, we saw this case where the Dutch court said Shell have to pay, and that was unprecedented. That was a huge win for civil society who've been doing this work for so long. But also as a result, we saw then Shell ran away from Netherlands to the UK, because of course they want to find a way. So we also see how just at the country level is not enough. We need a global coordinated structure. But for the government of UK, they were of course happy that the Shell is moving to them, and they get welcome all this money. So I think these are then examples to also see how we must do this event, that how we need to be coordinated. We need again that there as well, like a coordinated effort. And was the second question to all of us or to me?
That was to you, Tonny Nowshin.
Okay. I think I might have forgotten the question. So what can the civil society do, or?
Yeah, exactly. You've touched on it a little bit already, but just the question of what civil society can actually do, what consumers can do, or whether they are reliant on decisions of laws and multilateral institutions.
Yeah, I think just generally what we don't get, there should be a course, but of course the rulers don't want you to be so empowered, right? So, but I think there should be a course in the school from a very early age that teaches us, like, of course, if there's this discussion like how to be a good citizen, you engage, but also to allow to know that each one of us, we hold certain power, and any act of, like, it could be a lot, like we even when we feel we are very powerless, we have a set of tools at our disposal. And depending on which country we are in, of course, how oppressive your government is, that heavily curbs what you can and cannot do. But I think definitely the citizens must actively start getting engaged, because climate is going to impact all of us. And there's, you could, and I think maybe in the face of fear, many of us feel like have this, how you call it, this deer in front of a car, like this, we freeze, we don't know what to do, and we feel we cannot do anything. I think the best way is to, I would say, always organize, like, and it doesn't mean you have to do big things. It can be very simple things. You can start learning. You can just, first step is always just start reading more, learning more, and then just start having conversation with your mom, with your dad at your dinner table, and then look what you can do immediately. But of course, at the same time, just by cutting the plastic bottles just by changing your consumption patterns, because the scale of it is so huge, we wouldn't be able to avert it. So of course we need change in personal level in our consumption behavior, but it has to be done in a collective way. Unless it's held in a broader social structure, it also would drain you a lot. It would take away a lot of energy from you. And there are also the stories how it was actually the oil companies that started this concept of individual adjusting their consumption to save the planet and environment, that takes away your power as a political agent. So I think that's then always the more power lies. Look for, in whichever scale you think you feel powerful, but whichever policy you support, you can talk with your MP, you can ask them to do more climate issues. If you're investing, you can call the company that you're investing through and demand that they invest their money more responsibly. If you have a bank account, you can always call your bank and say, I want you to be more climate conscious. And all of this matter, like again and again, we see these tiny acts of civil activism. If you don't find activism is a too strong word, but just then civil awareness, conscious engagement can make a huge difference. So I think, and there's a lot to do and every one of us can do something. So I think the first stage is getting aware and then start looking out what you can do. And yeah, and it's best not just the individual actions, but more systematic you can be. So reaching out, and we're all embedded in different infrastructures, systems. So that's very helpful.
Thank you so much for that. And Nnimo Bassey writes that on a cultural level, a great tool can be found in shaping of our collective imaginaries. Insightful comment in the chat. I'm mindful of everybody's time. I think we have time for one more very brief question to wrap it up. I would turn it over to IFA's Yannick Ringo for a final question for our panelists.
Yeah, hello. I think some of the points that I would like to ask have already been touched on. The question is about how to get actively engaged. Nnimo Bassey just wrote that focusing on negative tracks, business as usual, and climate doomsday reporting in the media will kind of stifle activism, because it kind of paralyzes people, as Tonny just mentioned. So on the one hand, I think it's really important to know the facts. So I think that people get informed is really important. And I think it was also one of the things that were at the root of the Fridays for Future movement. But beyond the facts, you need to have some sort of positive vision. Where do you want to go? Not only what do I want to avoid? We had in the meeting yesterday, we had one of the participants said it's like, if you only focus on the negative things, it's like going to a taxi driver and tell him, don't take me to the train station. Like, where do you want to go, right? So, and I think this kind of thinking about like positive and believable or plausible target is what's needed to bring the people along who have decided that this is the problem but don't know what to do. And especially in the context of the deep divides between the industrialized countries and the more vulnerable countries, how to bridge these gaps of we need to develop our economy. We have poor people here, and now you want to take away easy sources of energy. This kind of dynamic that can really sabotage constructive working on this more general problem. So my question is, how do we construct this positive vision that can bridge these demands and acknowledge both of them? Say, okay, yes, it's important that we have socioeconomic development, but it's also important, very important, that we do it in a climate-friendly way. Yeah, how can we build this? What are your experiences from your work?
This was a question for Nnimo Bassey. Is that correct?
I think so, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's a very huge question. And but it's really something for us to go home on and dream about and think about. But sometimes people get overwhelmed and wonder, what do we do? What can we do? But I personally ask myself, why go to the COP, the Conference of Parties, for example, when you know that they're not going to come up with anything useful? But then that provides a big space for a lot of conversations of not in the official space, but in the outside space. And so I think we really need to invest more energy on the inside space and find ways of bringing the inside outside. In other words, we really need to spend a lot and think about building counter COPs, something contrary, counter, new structures. The United Nations was built based on realities of the 1940s. Is it still valid today? Do we need to invent a new one, a new system? We just can't get trapped in one track that is not yielding results or that has been corrupted and co-opted. And so it's a big challenge. I think the question is not what we can dissect at once, but it's something we can chew on. Pardon my using of that term. We shouldn't really chew on anything, but then why do we have teeth? So, yeah. So more sharing, more coming together, and then we can find the best way to move forward.
Fabulous. I think that's a really wonderful place to leave this talk. I want to thank everybody so much for sharing your expertise. I think it was a really fruitful and insightful discussion, and it will be available on YouTube online for people to go back and reference in their work or to listen back to any moments that they think would be useful in future discourse. So thank you also to the audience. We do want to hear more from you as well. You could send your comments to us by email at research@ifa.de, or it would be great if you followed us on Twitter. That's at IFA Cult, CULT, and then extern, EXTERN. So thank you once again. I really appreciate everybody's time and wishing you a wonderful rest of the week.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you.